Welcome to the REI Rookies Podcast.
The Real Estate Investing Rookies Podcast, episode number 62, where we invite you to follow us on our journey towards financial freedom using the power of real estate. I'm Josh Koth.
And I'm Jack Haas.
And here at the REI Rookies, we believe in a couple key principles. Number one, the best way to retain information is by teaching it to others. And number two, a rising tide lifts all boats. We're not competitors, we're a community. So let's get into some real estate investing.
So we're going to tackle a pretty controversial topic this week, aren't we, Josh?
Controversial, huh?
Controversial.
Yes.
So today we're going to talk to Josh about his experience in selling his personal home and how his family is adjusting to the new digs and living in a rental property.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. You're a real estate investor, a supposedly seasoned, experienced real estate investor, and you don't own the house you live in. Well, our company does, but I don't. So that seems like a weird thing to say. Why wouldn't you own your own home, right, in your own name? And it's something that it took me a long time to come around to that decision, that was the right decision to make. But the more you realize, you take stock of what your assets are and what they're producing for you, you come to the conclusion that your house, your personal home, as an asset does not perform. It's a non-performing asset. It's not putting money into your pocket every month. And that's the rich dad, poor dad, Robert Kiyosaki definition of whether something's an asset or liability, right? An asset puts money in your pocket, a liability takes money out. Well, just on that simple definition alone, your personal home is a non-performing asset. It's a liability because it's costing me money every month to live in that abode. So we'll get into the kind of the mechanics of that, of how I came to that decision. But, what are your thoughts? You still live in a house that you own. What do you, a few years ago, if somebody were to say, a real estate investor is not going to shouldn't own his own house, what would you think of that as a statement?
Well, I mean, like you said, we've been brainwashed from a young child that your house is your most important or your biggest investment that you can get into.
Yep.
And but like you said, once you're red pilled, it's hard not to look at it that way. In my case, we purchased the family homestead, so it's a big thing to keep it in the family. I don't really ever see us leaving from there.
Right.
But in a similar situation, one of the first things that we did when we became red is pull some equity out to buy a rental property.
Right.
So we're kind of doing a similar thing, but you're just taking a very different approach to it.
Yeah, you're still tapping into that equity. You're realizing that the equity sitting in your house is not an investment. And that's the mindset switch that has to be flipped in your brain. Is most people, including myself until a couple of years ago, would have thought, well, your home is your biggest investment. And honestly, my goal was to have my house paid off. In fact, I refied, I think 2 houses ago, I refied my house a couple times, going from a 30-year to a 21 to a 15, because I was in love with that, paying down the principal and having that asset sitting there with full equity in my possession, owing nothing to the bank, and having, a $200,000 house just sitting there all paid for. And still, even now, that sounds like an awesome idea, right? I love the idea of having no debt, no mortgage. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's just, once that equity is sitting there, what is it doing? It's basically retired. Like Matt Terrio from Epic Real Estate says, you don't want your money to retire before you do. And if your equity, every dollar sitting there in equity is basically retired. And to get into a little bit of the details of that, basically, unless you live in a crazy market, which we'll talk about some of the differences of different markets, different areas of the country. But, here in our market, our houses appreciate, between 2% and 5% a year, right? And what's the average inflation rate in America? It's right around there.
Yeah, I think the last one I saw was almost 3%. At that point, you could potentially be losing money.
Yeah, right. If you live in a slow appreciation real estate market and you're not keeping pace with inflation, You're and what really matters is the buying power of a dollar, right? Like how many hours of work does it take for me to generate the money that can buy a carton of milk? Because obviously the price of a carton of milk goes up over the 30-year duration of your mortgage, so obviously it's going to be more. But that dollar, if you put it into your house and you take it out 30 years later, how many of those dollars in today's dollars does it take to buy that same carton of milk? And my argument is every dollar sitting in your house is probably going to buy the same amount of milk that it does now, even 30 years from now. So really, it's just keeping pace with inflation. It's not generating any other money. It's not producing for you as an asset. And to me, the definition of an asset is something that produces income, puts money in your pocket. And if a dollar you put into your house buys the same amount of milk that it, 30 years from now that it does now, that's not a income producing asset.
So we kind of found an interesting way to do this, right? Because Josh has moved into a rental house that he as a company purchased. So
right.
We are actually putting a little money in our own pocket and adding to a little cash flow. It's kind of a win-win in that front.
Yeah, and for all the married people out there, tread lightly when you bring this idea up, because I'm as red-pilled as it gets. Right, I would have moved into a fourplex, right, and lived in one unit. But when you have 3 kids and you're married, your wife, going from a big house with a big backyard, that's not a favorable move. But on paper, it's great. You can pretty much live for free at that point. But since that wasn't really an option, I did the next best thing, which was have our company purchase a house that we knew would work as a rental after we were done living in it. So that was step one: find a house that you could. Because the problem was the house I was living in was a house I liked, but it was way too expensive to keep as a rental, so that just wouldn't even qualify. And it was nice. I love the neighborhood. I love the size and the yard and everything. That there is some sacrifices at play here. But we picked out a house that would work as a rental when we're done living in it. Bought that in our company's name, and then I'm renting it personally from our company. So that benefits us personally because it hits our income or expense targets that we're trying to hit with the amount of rent we're spending. And then the cash flow benefits the business, obviously. And, honestly, I'm a great tenant and I have a great landlord because it's both are me and you. So that's nice. The thoughts of leasing from someone that wasn't me, that wasn't very attractive. But there's plenty of real estate investors out there that do that. They rent from just a local landlord, and I'm sure it would have worked. I know plenty of landlords in our market that I could have rented from and been fine. But just, I didn't want to go back to that thought of like going back to doing a check-in and a check-out and an approval process and all that stuff. I don't know. It didn't sound very fun. So I had to get over that mental hurdle. And so we actually purchased a house, moved into it about a week ago. And we just closed on the sale of my personal residence today. So that was interesting, walking out of there with a pretty big check. And our goal is to put a little money aside and then invest the bulk of that into the business, right? I'm going to be a private lender to our company or use it to purchase real estate. And we'll use it to purchase real estate. And that's kind of how I'll offset some of my rent that I'm paying out too. So my overall cost of living somewhere every month is going to drop significantly. And that's really the ultimate goal, because that gets us closer to financial freedom, which is what we're after. And it benefits the company by acquiring another asset that we can use in the future for someone else as well.
One of the things that I think is really interesting, and I think it's a lesson that we kind of learned, is, we run into quite a few people, whether it is locally or when we go to these seminars, and people are still looking for their first deal. We kind of took a different approach to finding your rent, the place you're going to be living. We actually targeted an area and blasted everybody in that area with basically an offer until we found one. I mean, it was a very different way in which to find a property. But I mean, it really was an example of how even a targeted effort in a small, I don't even say small market, you can still produce results.
Yeah, it was a good tactic to try out. just for finding investment properties, not even ones to live in. But since my wife had a very specific geographic area she would allow me to purchase in if we were going to live in it, it forced me to target that particular area. So I just basically worked with our agent and listed every property in this square and just literally shotgunned offers out to every property that was on the market, and wanted to try to get it at a price that would work for the company. So that was kind of interesting experience. And I think that approach could work for finding investment properties too. Just pick a neighborhood that is a good place to hold rentals, or, if you're flipping or whatever, a desirable neighborhood that people want to live in for flips, and just go after every property in that neighborhood, whether it's on the MLS or off market, whatever. I think that could totally work.
So how's the family adapting to this? Has it been pretty good? I know there was some pain points regarding just the move.
Yeah, moving sucks. Even if you're moving from one mansion to another mansion, it's still a pain in the butt. We hired movers. We tried to make it as seamless. That was kind of my deal I made with my wife, tried to make it as seamless as possible, but still a pain in the butt any way you slice it. And to be honest, this is a sacrifice too. We went from a 5-bedroom, 3-bath with a huge yard to a 3-bed, 2-bath with a tiny yard. So I'm also putting a fence up too for the dogs. That was another part of the arrangement that I made with my wife. That it is a sacrifice, and I'm trying but the thing is, kids are very adaptable, and they're playing, they're having fun. They don't really care what type of house you live in. And that's almost kind of a lesson there. We all aspire to have the big house and all the, everything that goes with that. And really that's not that important. I mean, your kids, as long as you model that example, they'll be happy anywhere that you put them. So I'm just trying to really model that and say, look, this is our home. Wherever we're at as a family is our house. And if we were in an apartment, that'd be fine. We'd still love each other just as much, right? It doesn't really matter where you live. And I think kids, that's their default position. So that's actually been really good. They might complain if 2 of the bathrooms are being used and we used to have a third, little things like that. But I think they'll come to understand later when they're older, why we made the sacrifice in order to get to financial freedom that much quicker. And that results in having more time to spend together. So I think we're all, on the same page there. And my wife understood too what the goal was, but it was still difficult to execute, to find somewhere she could stand to live. That was understandably a sacrifice, but not so bad that she was like, I don't want to live in that. And you went through it with me, right? We got a couple of houses shot down, right?
Yeah.
Ones I had no problem with. I would have been perfectly happy living in them. But she was like, just nope, finger wag, nope, not doing it. I'm gonna live in that one. It's like, well, we still bought it anyways and ended up wholesaling it to someone else. It still worked as an investment, but when you're purchasing as an investment, that's a little bit different than one that your family's going to live in. So they don't always overlap.
So, we've talked about in the past, the abundance mentality. Mm-hmm. How did you justify, or how did you come to an agreement? Because we've been talking about that quite a bit. You have to have that abundance mentality, and you seem to be able to grow up to your own expectations. So how did you suppress that a little bit when it came to downsizing, essentially?
Well, to me, the overarching goal is financial freedom. So that's our compass. That's our true north, right? So anything that moves us along that timeline closer to that is abundance, right? So, whether how big your house is and all that, I mean, I don't care about that, honestly. Like if you talk to your average person, to me, if I'm going to judge, not judge someone as a person, but judge someone's financial health, show me your net worth, right? That's really what, to me, is impressive. Your net worth and like the amount of money you're generating passively, that's something to aspire to. So this move made us closer to that goal. So I see that as a lofty pursuit. And, if I'm living in a smaller house now that is not as impressive or whatever, honestly, it doesn't even factor in, right? And I never cared about that even when I was in a bigger house. It was, it was nice and everything, but I don't attach a lot of significance to that. So it was fine.
So I think a lot of people are going to want to know, like, how did you actually, in the end, convince the wife? Because I mean that is a pretty shock to the system. Like,
Well,
how do you get your spouse on board?
same way I convinced her to let me empty my IRA and start using it to invest in properties. I just explained the scenario and ran side by side comparisons, right? Had a little PowerPoint, I'm just kidding.
I didn't put it past you.
Yeah, I should have. But, when you run you say, okay, in this big house, and here's the thing too, when you think about owning a house versus renting, the expenses in a bigger house are a lot more. The property tax was triple what we're going to pay now, what our company will pay for the one that I'm living in. It costs a lot more in utilities to heat it. There's a sprinkler system, all these things to maintain, and just your average outgo every month. It was about $2,500 total, right? Between, the mortgage payment and taxes and all the utilities and everything else, about $2,500 to live in this house. And, that may not sound like a lot in other markets, but just to give you a point of reference, I figure now with using the money to, my equity to invest in the company and get paid back as a private investor, that'll offset my rent. And it should reduce my monthly outgo by at least $1,000, probably closer to $1,500, depending on how things work out with utilities and things. So that right there, that's like buying 3 or 4 more rentals and adding them to your portfolio. So that to me is how I measure my financial health now, is the amount of passive income and how much closer I am to the financial freedom. So getting $1,000, $1,200 a month closer to that, that's a huge leap in my mind. So that wasn't hard. Once she understood that thought process that I was having, then, she was on board. As long as I hired movers, got a fence, and was only allowed to buy in a certain geographical box.
So if somebody was going to go now in hindsight, after you've done this, what kind of advice would you give somebody, like some key points of, like, if they were planning to do something similar?
What I would have done differently is, honestly, when I was younger, I would have bought a duplex or a fourplex, lived in one unit, bought it under my personal name, getting the cheapest money borrowed possible, right? Get that low money down, just regular bank financing, first time home buyer, and lived in one unit, rented the other ones out, and then just leapfrog to another one and do that a couple of times. So you have 3 or 4 of those in your, mortgages and all assets under your name. And then, just start growing from there. Cause that could be a great start for someone. So if I could go back in time, that's totally what I would do now. It's pretty hard to go from the big house that you own back down to this level. It is a big mental leap. So, I would say to anyone younger who hasn't purchased a house yet, if you still have the opportunity to do it that way, do it that way. That's much simpler, because then you can always grow into the bigger house. And I want to make it clear, there's nothing, I'm not against owning a house or buying a house to live in. I mean, I think it's a great thing to spend money on. It's a great purchase if that's important to you to have a big house. Just understand that it's a purchase. It's just like buying a car or not as bad as buying a car, but it's something you're spending money on. And if you want to spend your money on that, that's okay. But just do not call it an investment, right? Because it's, by our standards, it's not an investment. It's a purchase, and you obviously have to live somewhere. You have to have a living expense every month. So my goal is just to minimize that and have the rest of my equity or available assets of any kind producing as much as they can.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. In fact, this last real estate investing meetup here that we had locally, we had our youngest potential investor join us, 18 years old, right out of high school.
Right.
Can you imagine where we'd be right now if we had started at 18?
Yeah, I mean, if you just follow that house hacking strategy, as they call it, on Bigger Pockets, and just, buy a duplex, live on one side, and just keep leapfrogging, man, I mean, you can get to financial freedom real fast doing that.
Well, why don't we just close out the episode? I don't know if we have anything else to add to this one.
I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this topic. Make sure you hit us up on our Facebook page. search for REI Rookies. Email us at info@reirookies.com. Hit us up on Twitter at REI Rookies. I'd love to hear people's thoughts, because this topic typically gets people's wheels turning and really gets some pretty strong feedback. I've gotten a lot of pushback, from relatives and things when I tell them what I'm doing. And because most people are still kind of thinking the way I used to think. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just how I'm choosing to pursue financial freedom. So we'd love to hear what you guys think about that. So hit us up on all those sources. Make sure you head over to iTunes also. Subscribe to the podcast. Rate us. Review us. We love the feedback.
And if you find that you're stuck in a situation where you have some money sitting aside and you want to participate in some of our activity, why don't you head over to investwithbpp.com and I'll give you some details there.
Awesome. I'd love to help out other investors out there. If you sold your house, you got a bunch of equity, you need to put it to work, we can do that for you.
So remember, get off the bench
and get into the game. We'll see you next time.